Okay, so this is for haslacha for the soldiers, that they successful in their mission, return home safely, and for refer for all the cholim of Klal Yisrael. So in this week's, the previous parsha which we read today is Parshat Beshalach, and the Maftir reminds us on the first of two occasions that we have to remember Amalek and wipe out Amalek. And in the commentary, it says here very interestingly, which I give you one sec, which I saw here. Yes, I lost the place here. 1 second. It says, actually, it says Amalek committed an unprovoked attack out of its land out of its land to the people that were militarily unprepared. Now that sounds very interesting to, unfortunately, that the Israeli they were unprepared for this. So it sounds a lot of similarities in that, what Amalek did, to what happened on October the 7th, and unfortunately on some other occasions as well. I think the 6-day war may have, but it says unprovoked attack, and the victims were not prepared militarily.
Okay.
And how's that for similarities?
So what do you derive from there? That there has to be the Stadler point about being militarily prepared in order to get divine intervention. What do you come out with it with?
And I'm just making that point. I'm not making any
It certainly
point. I'm
does
just saying the
parallel.
similarities.
It definitely does parallel events. All right, guys, let's get into the Gemara. Kev, thank you. Thank you very, very much. By the way, thank you the other day for Tu Bishvat. You taught us a lot. It was great to have that on the show. So let's get
Was it a very fruitful show, Damon?
Very fruitful show. All right, let's get started. All right, guys, so we're on the 116th daf. We've got 3 dafs to finish. And what we were discussing is this risk that if you've got wine and you keep it in storage, but it's tamei, it's in a state of impurity, and the Levi gave it to the Kohen as part of the truma of his 10%, then if it's tamei, the Kohen can't consume it. So what is the Kohen able to do with it? He's able to use it for sprinkling for the aroma of his home. But the risk is that if he ends up keeping it, will he come to partake and drink it? Maybe initially he wouldn't, but maybe if there's other alcohol around, he might have a couple of glasses of scotch, etc., and then come to partake of wine that at that point he doesn't know is tamei. My question with the Gemara was quite simply, why don't you just certainly seal it, not in a different container, but that's unopenable without a big label stating on top, tamei. But for reasons that the Gemara hasn't revealed, obviously what we meant to do is derive the bottom line principles. And Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel have two different opinions. So Beis Shammai said, you've got to pour out all of that at once, meaning any tamei wine, you shouldn't keep it at a later point where you're going to use it sporadically to sprinkle to create an aroma around your home, should you come to drink it. And it's going to bring you to transgression. But Beis Hillel isn't having that concern at all. He said, you can use it for sprinkling. We're not concerned that the Kohen might come to drink it. So we see that this issue about keeping tamei truma, basically wine, for sprinkling is a matter of Tanaic dispute. Initially, when we discussed it, it was a discussion of the Amoraim, but we see that this is a very, very old dispute. So, in other words, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel make no differentiation between new wine and aged wine. Their ruling occurs in both places. So what did we say? Where was the discussion? As far as we were concerned, that new wine didn't have any aroma to it, and therefore you'd have to age it if it was tamei in order to have the aroma that was going to give benefit for sprinkling. But as far as they're concerned, there's no mention of it. It's either a risk or it's not a risk. So Beis Shammai forbade even using aged wine for sprinkling. So he was saying, although aged wine can be sprinkled immediately and need not remain in the Kohen's possession for very long, the reason why, according to Beis Shammai, you must pour it all out at once is we fear that if he sprinkles the wine little by little through the course of the day, he might come to drink some of it. Okay, and it is a concern, even when we're not taking the timeline out to months. Now, as far as that's concerned, Beis Hillel says that you can even use new wine for sprinkling. Just hang on one sec, Yitzhak. More than welcome to come back and sit here. So what we are saying is that Beis Hillel is saying that even if there's a longer timeline, and it's new wine and it's going to take months to age, or a year or two, we're not concerned that aging the wine and having it in storage will lead the Kohen into an unwitting transgression. So the question of whether or not we're concerned that keeping Tamei Truma might cause a person to transgress is obviously a subject of dispute between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. Shammai holds that it's a concern, you can't keep it, and Beis Hillel said it's not a concern. Okay, so basically, let me just put the share on pause a second. Give me a second, guys. All right.
Okay.
All right.
No, so I want to stop recording.
Arthur, he was just checking if you were back. Did you get that
I
one,
was going to
Damon?
say something, but not for recording. So
no, I don't know. All right, guys. I don't want to interrupt my train of thought. It's being interrupted enough. I'm on the hairline of sanity here. I'm on the hairline. So Rav Yishmael, the son of Rav Yossi, said, I will tip the balance between these two views. If the barrel of Truma wine became Tamei in the house, it should be used for sprinkling. But if it became Tamei in the field, it should be poured out. So first thing to note is that Rav Shimon, the son... What is it now, Arthur?
No, again, it was a same recording.
Oh. Tell Pointy Bird I said hello. Oh. Okay. You didn't quote me, I guess.
Mate, let me explain to you. Every time she comes in here, I'm telling her, she's walking around the party and saying, on. But she had clothes on. I said, we're recording. So take some of your clothes off.
Arthur, stop it now. Arthur.
I have no words. Okay. All right. So we were talking. Okay. So now what we're saying, guys, is Rav Yishmael, the son of Rav Yossi, came centuries later, and he said, "Look, this earlier tonight dispute, I'm going to actually add clarity, and what I've got to say will tip the balance between those two views." Okay. And if you remember, his colleague said, "What are you talking about? Whatever you've said doesn't tip the balance, and we're going to find out why." But just as a summary to find out what he said, he said, look, if the barrel of Truma wine became Tamei, impure, in the house, it should be used for sprinkling. But if it became Tamei in the field, it should all be poured out. So all he's basically saying is that the reason why the wine in the house can be used for sprinkling is because it's immediate. We're not concerned that the Kohen might unthinkably drink it in the short amount of time that it takes to sprinkle the wine. But wine in the field has to be transported into the house because you can't obviously aromatize a field. And that period of time of an hour and a half trek, consider it like going from Linksfield to the other end of Hartebeersport and back, we fear that the Kohen might unwittingly drink some of it. That's according to Rashi. So the issue is when there's distance, it creates a time lag. And when there's a time lag, it's going to be risky. There's another version of Rav Yishmael's statement. And some say that he said in the case of aged wine, you can use it for sprinkling. But in the case of new wine, it should all be poured out. Again, the same principle. If new wine hasn't developed the aroma, it's going to take weeks, months, or years to develop the aroma for sprinkling, and therefore that time period puts the Kohen at risk for unwittingly drinking it. If it's aged wine, he can sprinkle it immediately, and it's certainly not going to be the same level of risk. And when the Brisa continues and his contemporaries said to Rav Yishmael, the son of Rav Yossi, that your weight of the third opinion can't tip the balance between two opposing views unless it addresses specifically the points raised in the original dispute. So in other words, your opinion didn't raise any of the issues of Beis Hillel, Beis Shammai, because it doesn't weigh in the dispute. So what does this actually mean? So firstly, as we did say last time, just as a bit of a summary, is that there were two factors he aged that Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai never mentioned. And that is this issue of the Tameh wine in the field versus the house, which was an issue they never brought, and new and aged wine, which again was never an issue between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. Beis Shammai said you cannot use the wine at all, it has to be poured out immediately. And Beis Hillel said that you can store it and there's no risk to the kohen. Not going to drink it. So let me just give you a general rule in Gemara Shabbos 39b, that the halacha accords with the one who tips the balance. So what does it mean? So the reason it doesn't fall under the heading is because there's a specific way that you have to deal with the disputants. Firstly, if you're a Tana, as Gavin mentioned last time, is that whatever your opinion is, it's 2 against 1, the majority rules. You're fine. But if you're not a Tana and you're coming generations later, you're actually going to have no weight on the issue unless you use the Tanaic arguments themselves. So what we learned with Schottenstein, and Gavin will remember this, it's if you have a Rishon or a somebody that came after one of the Tanaim, because there were 5 generations, in order to refute a Tana, you have to bring an argument from another Tana of the same generation with the same amount of stature to argue. So it's like playing a game of chess. So, for example, now we don't have a Sanhedrin, so we can't overturn a halacha or make a different halacha. It works that the closest source we have to Sinai is generally the strongest source of the authoritative opinion. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, so what has to happen in this case is because as a later generation, you have to be basically in partial agreement with each of the disputants. So what does that mean? There's different facets of the discussion, and the opinion combines with each Tana with whom he agrees to form a majority of you. Can I explain to you what this means? So what that basically means is that outweighs the opinion of a single Tana. And where do we derive this from? Shmot chapter 23, verse 2. According to the majority shall the matter be decided. But it applies only when the different facets of the discussion are brought forward by the disputants themselves. So in that case, the mediator combines with each to outweigh the other. It's not that he agrees with one against the other. Let me give you an example. If Beis Shammai had stated whether the wine became tameh in the field or in the house, and that was the basis on whether it should be spilt out, and Beis Hillel replied basically that in that particular case, both the field and the house, it could be used for sprinkling, then you have an issue. So, for example, the first factor that has to come to play is that when you've got this issue with Rav Yishmael, the son of Rav Yossi, he can only bring a matter to the fore that's brought by Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. So let me give you an example of what would happen here. Beis Shammai would have an opinion and say, whether the wine that was tameh was in the field or in the house, you have to pour it out immediately. Because remember, Beis Shammai is a blanket rule. It's too risky. It's not worth the chance. You can't use it to store it for sprinkling of the aroma. So whether the time period is short or long, in that particular case, he would say you'd have to throw it out. If Beis Hillel said whether in the field or the house, you would have to, you can keep it because it would pose no risk to the kohen, then that is the opposite opinion, taking into account the factor of the field or the house. But one of the reasons why Rav Yishmael, the son of Yossi, isn't going to tip the balance is neither of them made this differentiation of the field and the house. So how would circumstantially he tip the balance? The reality here has to agree with both situations. Let me give you an example. Okay. Rav Yishmael would have to say, in the case of Beis Hillel, in the case of Beis Shammai, that as far as if Beis Shammai was mentioning the field and the house, that as far as the field is concerned, there's a distance of travel, and therefore the risk there is a sufficient amount of time to warrant concern. In that case, he would agree with Beis Shammai and then form the majority of opinion with Beis Shammai. If it was a case where the one was in the house, that was Tameh, the Truma Tameh that was in the house, then in that particular case, Rav Yishmael would agree with Rav Hillel, who says there's no risk, because while it's in the house, it can be used for sprinkling, and therefore in that he would form the majority of opinion with Rav Hillel. So he agrees with each of the disputants. He cannot go two against one because he comes centuries later. But he can, in factors that they bring out, form a majority circumstantially based on each of their opinions within the character. Or you can say the same thing with aged wine or new wine. So if a factor between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai was brought about aged and new wine, and Beis Shammai said whether it's aged wine or new wine, Truma, that is Tameh, is at risk being drunken by the Kohen. In that particular case, you're not going to take a chance. And Beis Hillel said whether the wine is new or aged, there's no risk of the Kohen consuming the Truma Tameh wine, and it can be used for sprinkling. In this particular case, okay, Rav Yishmael, the son of Rav Yossi, could combine each of their opinions and say the following. And he would say like this: according to Beis Shammai, he would agree, because in the case of new wine, there's too long a time period at which it's going to take to age, and therefore it's a risk. But as far as aged wine is concerned, he would agree with Beis Hillel and say that it poses no risk for aged wine because he's not going to consume it or partake of it during the course of the day when he's sprinkling. The only reason he perhaps would agree with Beis Shammai is if it was sitting on the shelf for months. So if they brought out the factors of new or aged wine, okay, then in that particular case, it's a factor that you could offer a mitigating opinion, or field or house wine upon the point at which it became tameh, again because of the timeline of risk. He could agree with Beis Shammai in one aspect and Beis Hillel in another and tip the balance. But he cannot be used a two against one opinion unilaterally. Am I making sense, guys?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm making sense.
Yeah.
Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause the recording for a reason, whole thing.
Should I repeat myself?
Yeah, please.
Okay, so if a later opinion or later rabbi with an opinion many years after the Tanoim instituted their opinions or had their opinions cast out, a person with a later opinion will only have validity in his opinion if it is in step with the Tanoim, because the Tanoim's opinion can't be overridden. Then it can be, it will be a valid opinion if it is in line or has many similarities with the original Tanaic opinion.
So if you were one of the Amoraim or the Rishonim, okay, what would you do when you argued with a Tana? What strategy would you apply, Kev?
You'd have to see what their opinion was. And then there would have to be the framework would have to have been the same before one even started. the general
It's valid.
views. Otherwise, it's not going to override. It can't override what their opinion was.
Okay. Anybody want to add to what Kevin said in terms of if you were one of the Amoraim or a Rishonim, how would you argue with the Tana? What's the first easiest way to do it, if you can? Arthur? Just an awesome.
Of course, you're going to pick me when I'm bending down, of course. The only easy way, Damon, is to come to you and ask your opinion.
That's very sweet, but okay. Kevin, do you have
Okay. So hold on.
Hang on.
Generally,
Arthur hasn't finished. Yeah, sorry, Arthur.
Okay, so I thought it was enough.
There's no somebody's turning off the light. Yeah.
Okay. Wouldn't it be a situation where the closer to the original source, I'd override the teaching from the further way source.
Excellent.
So let's say it was,
Excellent.
and you can't override it because unless you can use it and you can try come yourself, but you've got to use the original source as well.
So what Arthur's saying is correct. In other words, if the 5th generation of Tanoim, for example, you can't use a Tana from a 5th generation to outweigh a Tana from the 1st generation. You'd have to use generationally a colleague that was on par with the particular Tana that had an opinion contrary to you. And you would have to have a very good reason to bring a colleague of the same stature and the same generation of a Tana to argue with that primary Tana. What would be even better is if you had somebody from an earlier generation where that Tana couldn't dispute, which would be a easier way to do the checkmate. Now, in view of the fact that that's not possible, I'd like you guys to explain, Gavin can try now, the mechanism about how one of the Achronim or Rishonim can argue with the Tana on what sort of basis? What are the factors?
Damon, sorry. You know me, I always contribute. If I'm not feeling well, I'm just not feeling well.
I know you've got an ear infection, so your balance is off. You must be nauseous.
And when you asked if you're listening and all that, I was listening. I'm trying to absorb as best as I can.
I know, Gav. Listen,
if I say to you,
it's not an issue.
yes, it means I heard you. I did hear you. I can't give it over. I can't do anything.
It's not a problem. It's not a problem.
I'm not feeling great. I apologize.
Yeah.
Maybe I might be wrong here. If the later Rav who may disagree with the time, if he has a Torah source or for his to back up his claim, it wasn't fully used by the original opinion, the Tanoim, then maybe he has a case. If he has strong backup for his views and can back it up with original sources that may not have been used correctly, possibly. Maybe that's wrong. I think I don't think there's any other way.
One point you're right, one point needs a bit of work. The Tanoim wouldn't have made a mistake. They never applied it incorrectly. They applied it in particular abstraction, but you have got two thoughts on what you're saying. The first thing of it is that if you've got an issue of sphora, logic, scriptural sourcing trumps logic. So it takes precedence over logic. A perfect case that you learn in Makot or in Sanhedrin is this case of Adim Zomamim. So let me just give you a case of Sphora versus the reality of the situation. So in a case of conspiring witnesses, what those conspiring witnesses thought to do to the apparent victim, if they're caught during the trial, is done to them. So if they sought to give him the death penalty, they put to death. If they sought to have him lashed, they get lashed, etc., etc. However, if the trial has concluded and that person got the death penalty, they conspiring witnesses don't get the reciprocal penalty they wish to do to their victim. Now, that is counterintuitive to logic, and this is a discussion of Schottenstein out. Why? Because logic is that if you get the reciprocal punishment on what you actually try to do to your fellow Jew, and failed. Surely in a case where you actually do that to your fellow Jew, even more so, you should deserve the reciprocal punishment. So that's a case where the kal v'chomer doesn't work. If in a weaker case you get the reciprocal punishment, surely when you actually achieve it and get away with it, you certainly deserve the reciprocal punishment. So that's a kal v'chomer of logic. It means even more so. So what we end up saying there is something else. We're saying that if you look at it at a deeper scriptural level, it's not true. Because why did they get the reciprocal punishment? For two reasons. Firstly, they perverted the ends of justice by using the holy judicial system and legislature to corrupt and get their personal outcome. And for that, it's a very serious offense. Not just that, but in addition to that, to plan and premeditate damage against another Jew. However, if in the middle of the trial this is found out, then to the glory of Hashem and the Sanhedrin and the Beis, we apply the reciprocal punishment as a way to give that person a kapora, an atonement for their sin, because they try to put somebody to death, they try to corrupt the justice system, they weren't successful, and therefore the only atonement is that what happens to them is what they try to do to another person. But if they actually succeeded, there are two other factors that have come into play. The one factor that has come into play is Hashem ordained it on whatever level, that that person was meant to die or meant to get lashed. Why? In a previous lifetime, they might have killed somebody. So there are many cases of somebody that's innocent that goes to their death. And Hashem obviously allows events to unfold in order that there's justice of when they reincarnated, they get to atone for sins, measure for measure, mida keneged mida. It says in Pikei Avot, when there was a skull floating, one of the Rabbonim said to the fellow rabbi, that person, skull who's floating, was killed because he killed others, and those that killed him shall be killed. Okay, so there's that concept. So that's an atonement where it happened because of previous Gulgulim. So that's the one factor that overrode it. But the person doesn't get the opportunity for an atonement or kapora if they were successful in corrupting justice, and God help them in the next world, because they've got no way of atoning by suffering that sin that they wished the punishment to go on to the other person. They cannot suffer themselves in order to atone. So they've got no basis for atonement, which is absolutely a far worse prospect than being atoned in this world measure for measure. So in actual fact, it's not a mercy they got away with it. As Rabbi Yosef Mizrahi said, it's the worst thing in the world. Best thing to do is be punished in this world rather than face retribution in the next world. So Kevin, that's a case where Svara logic would dictate that an actualization of something would of a committed premeditated act would be worse than a attempted act. So we see that scriptural sourcing supersedes logic. The other aspects, and we've got 8 minutes left, is to say that in order for a later generation to argue with the Tana, he cannot argue. What he can do is agree with both Tanas. This is the key. He has to agree with both Tanas on their different opinion, but just apply where the circumstance would go more in the favor of another, but yet agree with both of them. So how is this achieved? The first factor that it's achieved, listen carefully, is he cannot introduce any new subject matter against where the Tanoim never brought up those issues. Beis, Hillel, and Beis Shammai never brought up this issue of aged wine and new wine. That was a later generation issue by saying that new wine needed time to develop an aroma, and the months that it took to store would be a higher risk factor of the timeline of that Tamei Truma lying on the shelf where the Kohen might partake of it. Okay? The other factor that was introduced is if wine became Tamei, the Truma in the field, with a couple of hours it would take to bring it to his house, over the course of the day or course of that particular period, he might come to drink it inadvertently. Maybe it's a very hot day, the wine is super cold, and he might just have a sip. Like generally on Yom Kippur, it's a good idea to keep actually tape on the fridge on Shabbos, when you first start to keep Shabbos, if you're not from, you put tape on the lighting, so you don't come to break it. So we are saying these are eggs b'shoigeg, inadvertent, okay? So these were factors about the specificity of the field or the home in terms of distance, timeline, or new wine which takes time to age at risk, as opposed to aged wine which has the aroma, can be sprinkled. Now, these were not specific factors introduced in, but they were based on Tanaic principles. So Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel never brought either of those factors. Okay, but let's assume they brought the factor in of the field. Then what would happen is we would have to say that Rav Yishmael, the son of Rav Yossi, would say he agrees with Beis Shammai if the issue of the field was brought in, that it's too risky, and therefore, because of the distance and the timeline, you'd agree with Beis Shammai that you have to pour out the wine so that the Kohen wouldn't have any risk on a hot day of drinking that ice cold Tamei Truma and inadvertently consuming Tamei produce. And then he would agree on the same argument with Beis Hillel that there wouldn't be any worry if that wine became Tamei in the house, because it's not sufficient time to put the Kohen under any risk. So in other words, on the one fact he agrees with Beis Shammai, on the other with Beis Hillel, within this factor of the field and the home. But he's agreeing with both of them. So in a particular circumstance, he's agreeing more with the one tanna than the other. In another circumstance, it's more with the other tanna, but in principle, he's agreeing with both. And in the same with the aged and new wine, if Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai brought up those factors of aged and new wine, he'd say like Beis Shammai, with new wine, it's risky because there would be waiting for it to develop flavor by aging it over the months, etc., in order to aromatize it for sprinkling in one's home. It's too risky, and it agree with Beis Shammai, you'd have to throw it out and not partake at any risk. And he'd agree with Beis Hillel that if Beis Hillel brought out a topic of aged wine, that there would be no risk, and it would be perfectly safe to keep. But in other words, he's agreeing with both circumstantially and specifics. But the Tanoim would have to bring up those specifics. You can't introduce new specifics. You get what I'm saying? All right, guys, let's end on this note. I hope it makes sense. All right.
Not scared to say anything.
You don't have to, Gavin. I wish you better. I'm sorry you're not well, mate. Really.
Yeah. No, it's fine. It's fine.
When you say risk, do you mean risk of someone drinking that wine that's happened? That's
okay, so it's not
that's what you mean by risk.
The Kohen is at risk because in order for the Kohen to do services within the temple, he has to be in a state of tahor, purity.
He can't be intoxicated either.
He gets the truma, or even if there's no intoxication, he gets the truma from the Levi. So what happened is there's Ma'aser Rishon, which the Yisrael would give to the Levi. Then there's Truma Ma'aser, which the Levi would give to the Kohen, his 10%. And that Truma Ma'aser, we're talking of a case with the broken barrel and the lowering of value because the wine was tamei, impure, and this became a side argument. So it was to make sure that the Kohen doesn't consume Truma that's tamei because he has to be in a state of tahor, purity. But it came off the discussion in the Mishnah about risk of leakage of barrel, honey, wine. You remember. Okay, guys, lovely to see all of you.
Likewise.
Hope Hashem blesses all of you. Okay.
Thank you.
Stop the recording for a second.
Right.